Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me. This has been a bit of a reflective day for me. Over the last few years, I have been lucky enough to visit Easter Island or Rapa Nui essentially at least once a year, and obviously for pandemic reasons, that hasn't happened. I am happy that the people of the island have generally been protected. They had some early exposure and then closed down, and they've gone back to being one of the most remote places anywhere on planet Earth. I think they're officially the second most remote inhabited or permanently inhabited place on the Earth. Easter Island was named Easter Island simply because that was the day that the Dutch first encountered the island, so the first Europeans to set eyes on this tiny isolated speck in the middle of or the far eastern stretches of Polynesia. But politically, Easter Island or Rapa Nui actually belongs to Chile, and so therefore the main access point is from Santiago, the large capital of Chile, and then by air with principally land Chile. But when we put its isolation into perspective, so there is Chile 4.5 hours flight away off to one side, and then Tahiti can be reached in about 5 or 6 hours of flying north and west. So that's how isolated the island itself is, and it's also tiny. Easter Island as a formation is volcanic, although nothing's active these days. And so it sits perched really all on its own. There's a couple of tiny dots of rocks nearby, but it sits on its own and is about 162 square kilometers or 80 something square miles. So it's tiny, and the permanent population is about 4,500, all in HANGA. That's not how it was historically, but they live in the town of HANGA. There's probably several thousand Chileans working on the island as well. So there we are, Lorana, which is hello and goodbye. Perhaps some of you are familiar with aloha in Hawaii, but never ever miss a sunrise or a sunset on Easter Island. We can talk about these incredible statues, the moai, and that is, of course, why everyone wants to travel there, but just for the sheer beauty of this isolated subtropical spot. So every time I'm there, I go out for this sunrise, and then I always stay and watch sunset. But there's the quarry in the back. It's one of the volcanic cones, and that's where the moai were carved and then walked to their sites. Now, very importantly, really Easter Island is not the mystery it's played up to be. Now, these guys were put back up in the 1990s. They're facing in the way moai historically would have. They face in towards a family unit, or call it a clan of sorts. These were propped back up, but they were all toppled really as the society collapsed. And Easter Island is a study in societal collapse. It was so isolated, and it's an example of what happens when we use up all our resources. So here's the quarry. These fellows never made it home. There's one female moai. There's something like 867, probably 1,000 were actually erected over a period of several hundred years. Settlers may have arrived around 800 AD, or it could have been as late as 1200, but for about 400 years they had an active culture of building these ancestors. And once they stood them up from these quarries, then they would put eyes in them, bring them to life. But they did walk, so the mystery is gone as how they moved. They were not aliens. It's quite a light rock, and it's a malleable rock, and they would wander them down from the quarry and around to their family sites, and then they would recycle the previous statues that were underneath. And again, because it is this wonderful volcanic rock, it was quite easy to work with, although also fragile, and so many of them are just sitting in situ where they fell naturally during their movement. And so you see, quite thin, but they would have built them in such a way that they could be leaned forward and tipped on one side or the other. Of course, some of them may have been rolled on logs as well, but gradually the island became deforested, which also meant no more boats. And so people were very dependent on a chicken-based diet, and then whatever could be drawn out from the ocean. But it's a rough coastline. It's also remarkably cool in the winter, being subtropical. Again, a wonderful, mild climate as a tourist today, but would have been tough living off the land. I just come back to this photo time and again to see that beautiful rainbow just coming down over the South Pacific Ocean there. And there is something so pensive about it. But the entire island, from any high point, you see the ocean on all sides, and really nothing else. So it is vast and mixed and can rain. Punapau is another one of the archaeological sites. Now all of this is part of a national park. And this was where the hats or the caps on the heads were constructed. It's even a lighter stone, and they're just sitting there again. So it was one whole functioning economy. It could have supported somewhere between 15 and 25,000 people. Here's a sign you don't see everywhere in the world, but do not walk on stone heads. Now, of course, there is one in the British Museum in London, and there's one over in Valparaiso. Now, this is presumably what homes looked like during the time of the Moai, during the time of the construction. And it's really an upside down boat in a formation. People apparently wore virtually nothing, and they slept together in family units. They would have had very hard feet because the rock is hard. Now, this is walking from RANO, which is the famous big volcanic cone, right down to HANGA in the distance. And you'd walk right past the airport at that point. So really everyone lives there, but that's not the way it was structured historically. Now, these were stone houses that were later on, after the Moai were toppled, after the collapse of the society, the next religion was the Birdman cult. Feel free to Google it. There's a lot to say, but just a view of the volcanic cone here. It's just so dramatically beautiful, and the greens and the light change all the time. Also, down in the base of the cone, there are plants that are unique only to the island, and apparently they've used one in pharmaceuticals. So there's actually been a genuine positive effect. But look at these tiny islands out here. So during the Birdman cult, young men from different tribes would have to swim out and find the egg of a specific bird, a migratory bird, and bring it back, and then their families would rule the island for a year. That was not a recipe for social cohesion. Eventually, Rapa Nui society was stolen and taken off these rocky, dramatic shores and enslaved in South America. So the people still speak their language, Rapa Nui, which is a Polynesian language. However, so much of the written language is not understood anymore. There's the one beach. Chileans will say it's the most beautiful beach in Chile. I agree, although many Rapa Nui don't consider themselves Chilean. But there are Moai out there, and the water is just a lovely temperature. So make sure to allow enough days to enjoy that. And then modern art. So they've planted eucalypts and palm trees all over the island. Of course, it had been totally deforested. This is a creation myth, as I understand it. But just like to mention, at Tumi Tours, we do offer a tour consultation or travel consultation service. So if you're interested in traveling anywhere in the world, do contact us and we can help you through that. These chickens wandering around town and roosters, I suppose. But that was, of course, principally the diet. Food now is not as terribly expensive as people say it is on the island, and that's because it's subsidized from Chile. And there is sunset, which is just as remarkable as one can imagine at any time. So there is a wetter season and a drier season, but it's safe and friendly. And there are flights every day from the mainland in normal times, although it's well worth securing accommodation before getting to Rapa Nui. And there it is, the airport, Mataveri. And so you can function in Rapa Nui and in Spanish, and really many people speak English now. So yeah, it's a long way home. And anyway, when you take off, within seconds you're over water. And then you spend 4.5 hours over blue, maybe a tiny glimpse of Robinson Crusoe, and then you land back into Santiago. So thank you for participating, and please keep in touch. Peace and love, ladies and gentlemen.